Jacob Miller had lived most of his life on a quiet stretch of land in northern Texas. The ranch was old, built by his grandfather's hands, surrounded by wide open fields and fences that disappeared into the horizon. Once it had been full of laughter, the sound of hooves and the smell of fresh hay. Now it was a place of silence. The only sound that remained was the wind brushing through the dry grass and the creak of an old wooden gate that never quite closed. Years ago, Jacob had been a rodeo rider, a legend in small-town circles. People used to travel miles to see him ride. His name was shouted in every arena, his picture hung on the walls of diners and feed stores. He was known for his courage and the way he handled even the wildest bull as if he could read its soul. But that was before the night that changed everything. That night was supposed to be his biggest victory. The air had smelled of dust and sweat, and the crowd was louder than thunder. His best friend Eli Turner had been there too, cheering him on, ready for his own ride. They had grown up together, two dreamers who wanted to make a name for themselves on the rodeo circuit. But when the gate opened and Jacob's bull stormed out, something went wrong. The saddle slipped, the bull turned wild, and Jacob fell. Eli rushed forward to help, but in seconds the animal's violent turn took Eli's life instead. The crowd gasped, the music stopped, and everything after that moment was a blur. Jacob woke up in the hospital with a broken rib and a shattered spirit. He never rode again. The rodeo world moved on, but Jacob stayed behind, stuck in that night, replaying it in his head over and over. He blamed himself for what happened. He told everyone he was cursed, and in time, people started to believe it. After Eli's funeral, Jacob sold most of his horses, closed his gates to visitors, and turned into a man of silence. The locals whispered about him when they passed by his ranch. Some said he talked to the wind at night. Others said he was haunted. But no one really knew what lived inside his heart. Only guilt, regret, and an emptiness he couldn't describe. Years passed. The once strong cowboy now walked with a slow, tired step. His beard had turned gray, his hands rougher than the earth he worked. Every morning he'd wake before dawn, feed the few animals left, fix a fence or two, and then sit on his porch watching the sky change colors. It was his routine, a simple, lonely rhythm. But on one quiet evening, something unusual happened. The sun had just dipped below the hills, painting the sky with a deep orange glow. Jacob was cleaning the old barn, sweeping dust from corners that hadn't seen light in years. As he moved a stack of wooden crates, his boot hit something hard. He bent down and pulled out an old leather box, covered in dust, the kind that only time could make. He wiped it clean, and when he opened it, a folded note lay inside. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting rough but familiar. It was Eli's. Jacob's hands trembled as he opened it. The words were short and strange. Go deeper. Make it quick inside. The truth is buried where we began. He stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was real, his mind filled with questions. Why had Eli written this? What truth was he talking about? And what did it mean? Where we began. He thought maybe it was a message written before that night. Maybe something Eli had left behind without anyone knowing. But the timing felt too strange, too haunting. Jacob sat on the barn floor, the note resting in his rough palms. His heart felt heavy again, but this time there was also curiosity, a spark he hadn't felt in years. For so long, he had tried to bury his past, but now the past had found its way back to him. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit fields. He remembered the day he met Eli. They were just kids racing horses through the open plains, daring each other to jump fences. They had dreamed of being champions together. The phrase "where we began" echoed in his head. Maybe Eli meant that place, the old training pen near the creek where they practiced before their first rodeo. The next morning, Jacob took the note again and tucked it into his pocket. He saddled up his old horse, a quiet brown mare named Hazel, and rode toward the creek. The air smelled like rain, and the ground was damp under the horse's hooves. When he reached the spot, he dismounted and stood still for a long moment. The small corral was broken now, the fence leaning, the ground scattered with weeds. It had once been their world, a place filled with laughter, arguments, and dreams. Now it felt like standing inside a memory. Jacob walked slowly, looking around as if expecting to see Eli standing there, grinning, holding a rope, ready to ride again. Instead, there was only silence and the whisper of wind through the grass. He took out the note again and whispered, "Go deeper." He knelt down, running his hand through the dirt. It felt foolish at first, like chasing ghosts, but something inside told him to keep going. He dug a little with his hands, not knowing what he was looking for. He found only rocks, dry roots, and old pieces of wood. After a while, he sat back exhausted. "What are you trying to tell me, Eli?" he whispered softly. As the sun climbed higher, he finally stood up and brushed the dirt off his jeans. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a note Eli had written long ago that meant something only to him. Still, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message meant for him to find now after all these years. He rode back home with the letter still in his pocket, his mind racing. He didn't have answers, only questions, but for the first time in years his heart wasn't completely numb. That night as he sat by the fireplace, he looked at Eli's old photo hanging on the wall. "If there's something you want me to see," he said quietly, "I'll find it. I'll go deeper, like you said." He didn't know that this promise would be the beginning of something bigger, something that would finally break the shadow that had followed him for years. But at that moment he felt something shift inside, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. The curse he believed in for so long had started to lose its power. And though he didn't know it yet, redemption was already on its way. The night ended with Jacob stepping outside again, standing beneath the wide, endless sky. The stars were bright, the wind soft, and for a moment he almost felt Eli's presence beside him, like the past was whispering to him, asking him not to give up. Jacob took a deep breath and whispered back into the darkness, "All right, partner. I'll try again." The cowboy who once walked only with ghosts now had a reason to look forward, to follow the message wherever it led. 3 days passed since Jacob found the strange note in the old box. He had tried to distract himself with chores, but his mind kept returning to those words. "Go deeper. Make it quick inside. The truth is buried where we began." Every time he read them, he felt both curious and uneasy. It was like hearing Eli's voice calling from the past, asking him to do something he didn't yet understand. That morning, the sun rose behind a soft layer of clouds, bathing the land in a pale orange light. Jacob was repairing a broken fence near the barn when he heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. He rarely had visitors, and when he did, they were usually delivery drivers who dropped off supplies and left quickly. But this sound was different, slower, like someone unfamiliar with country roads. The truck came into view, a small blue pickup covered in dust. It stopped near the front gate. Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans, squinting as a woman stepped out. She wore a tan jacket, jeans, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. When she walked closer, he noticed her boots were city new, not made for mud or fences. "Morning," she said softly, her voice calm but sure. Jacob nodded, cautious. "Morning. Can I help you?" She gave a polite smile. "I'm Clara Hayes. I'm a writer, or maybe I should say trying to be one. I've been traveling around, collecting stories about old rodeo legends. People said you might talk to me." Jacob frowned slightly. "They said wrong. I don't talk about that anymore." Clara hesitated. "I understand. I'm not here to pry. I just thought maybe—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes drifting toward the barn. "You kept it just like he said." Jacob blinked. "Like who said?" She looked at him with steady eyes. Eli Turner. The name hit him like a sudden gust of wind. His breath caught in his chest. "You knew Eli?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded. "He was my father's trainee once, a long time ago. My father, Tom Hayes, was one of your trainers, too. He used to talk about you both. Said you were like brothers." Jacob's guard softened a little, though confusion filled his face. "Tom Hayes? I remember him," he said. "He left the circuit before the accident." Clara nodded again, her gaze softening. "Yes, and before he passed, he left me something, too. A letter." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It looked old, the edges worn and yellowed. It had a message. "I didn't understand it at first, but when I heard your name and what happened, I thought maybe it was meant for you, too." Jacob took the note carefully. When he opened it, his heart skipped. The handwriting was familiar, the same rough scrawl as Eli's, and the words were identical. "Go deeper. Make it quick inside." He looked up sharply. Where did you get this?" "My father said it came from Eli," Clara said. "He never told me how, only that Eli had asked him to keep it safe. My father carried guilt for years. Before he died, he told me there was something he never had the courage to reveal. He said if I wanted to understand, I should find you and give you this. Jacob stood frozen. His hands tightened around the paper. The words echoed in his mind again and again. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. 2 notes, same message, both connected to Eli. Miss Hayes, he said slowly. Why come now after all these years? Clara took a slow breath. Because my father believed there was something hidden, something that would clear your name. He said Eli left clues and that only you would know where to look. He told me to find you before the truth was lost forever. Jacob turned away, staring at the horizon. The sound of the wind filled the silence between them. He wanted to believe her, but part of him was afraid. He had buried that part of his life under years of guilt. To dig it up again felt dangerous, like reopening an old wound that never healed. Ma'am, he said quietly, whatever truth you're chasing, it won't change the past. My friend is gone and nothing will bring him back. Clara stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. Maybe not. But don't you think he'd want you to know what really happened? Jacob met her eyes. They were steady, kind, but also determined. The kind of look he remembered seeing in Eli's eyes before every ride. For a moment, it was as if she carried a piece of him. After a long silence, Jacob finally nodded. All right, he said. If we're doing this, we do it my way. I don't want noise, I don't want cameras, and I don't want the town knowing until we're sure. Clara smiled faintly. Fair enough. I'm not here for fame, Mr. Miller. I just want to finish what my father couldn't. The day faded into evening as they sat on the porch. Jacob told her about the box he found, the note, and how he had gone to the old training corral. Clara listened carefully, taking notes, but mostly just watching his expressions. She could see the pain behind his words, the weight of guilt he had carried for too long. When he finished, she said quietly, Then it starts there. Where we began. That place must be important. Jacob nodded. That's what I thought. But I looked, and there was nothing. Maybe you didn't look deep enough, she said softly, almost like a whisper. Those words made Jacob pause. They were the same words from the letter. Go deeper. That night, Clara stayed in the guest cabin near the barn. The moon was bright and the crickets sang softly in the grass. Jacob couldn't sleep again. He sat by the fireplace, turning the notes over and over in his hands. He thought about Eli, his laugh, his courage, the way he used to say every mystery had a key. He looked out the window and saw Clara's light still on. She was probably reading through her father's notes, trying to piece together the story. For the first time, Jacob didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, they met at sunrise. Clara had brought an old map of the rodeo grounds in the nearby land. She spread it out on the porch table, pointing to different spots. Here's the old arena, here's the creek, and here's your training pen. But look here. She traced her finger along a faded mark near the corner. This is the old storage shed. My father's note mentioned something about under the boards. Jacob frowned. The storage shed? That place was locked up after the accident. Exactly, Clara said. What if that's what Eli meant? Maybe the truth he wanted you to find is still there. Jacob stared at the map, then at her. The idea sounded crazy, but something about it felt right. By midday, they were on their horses, riding toward the abandoned grounds. The place hadn't changed much, still silent, still haunted by old memories. Dust covered the wooden stands, and the wind carried faint echoes of a cheering crowd that once filled the air. They walked together toward the storage shed, its door hanging by a rusted hinge. Jacob pushed it open, and the smell of old leather and dust filled the air. Saddles, ropes, and broken barrels lay scattered. It was like time had stopped the day of the tragedy. As they looked around, Clara found a wooden board near the back corner that seemed newer than the rest. She tapped it gently. A hollow sound answered. Jacob knelt beside her and pried it open with a crowbar. Beneath the floor was darkness, and then something metallic glinted faintly. They shared a look. Clara's eyes were wide with both fear and excitement. Jacob reached in carefully and felt a cold, square box. He lifted it out and set it down on the dusty floor. The lock had rusted away, and with one firm twist it opened. Inside lay a bundle of old papers tied with a string. Clara leaned closer, whispering, "This might be it." Jacob's hands shook as he untied the bundle. The top page had Eli's handwriting again. The words were short but heavy. "If you're reading this, then you finally went deeper. What happened that night wasn't your fault. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. But they both knew this was just the beginning. As they left the shed, Clara said softly, "You see, Mr. Miller, you weren't cursed. You were chosen to finish what Eli started." Jacob looked back at the old arena, the sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time since the accident, he felt something new. Hope. The morning sun spread a golden light across the empty rodeo grounds. Dust hung in the air, moving slowly like time itself. Jacob stood beside Clara, staring at the open box they had found beneath the shed floor. His hand still shook slightly from the discovery. Inside lay several old papers, faded photographs, and a few sealed envelopes with Eli's handwriting. He lifted one of the envelopes carefully, afraid it might tear. The first line made his breath catch. "If you're reading this, Jacob, then maybe I finally did something right." Clara stood beside him, watching quietly. Jacob continued reading aloud, his voice low and rough. "I know what happened that night wasn't an accident. Someone made sure your saddle would fail. I found out too late. I tried to fix it, but when I stepped in, it was already done. If anything happens to me, find Tom Hayes. He knows who did it. Go deeper, find the truth." Jacob stopped reading, his eyes wide. He looked at Clara. "Your father knew," he whispered. "He must have known all along." Clara's eyes softened. "He carried guilt for years, Jacob. I think that's why he wanted me to find you. He didn't know how to face it himself." Jacob ran his hand through his hair, feeling the old pain twist inside him. "So Eli died because he tried to protect me," he said quietly. "He wasn't just there that night by chance." Clara nodded slowly. "And now you finally know. But there's still something missing, and who did it and why?" Jacob took a deep breath. He looked at the rest of the papers. There were letters written to the rodeo management, complaints about unfair treatment, and one torn page from a notebook that mentioned a name: Grant Corman. Jacob frowned. He hadn't heard that name in years. Grant Corman, he muttered. He was a writer too. Always wanted to win the state championship. He lost to me 3 times before that final event. Clara looked at him. "Do you think he could have done it?" Jacob's jaw tightened. He had the motive. But proving it now after all this time, he sighed. It'll take more than words on paper. They spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through the box. The more they read, the clearer the story became. Eli had discovered that someone had tampered with the equipment before the championship ride. He had written to Tom Hayes for advice, but before any action could be taken, the tragedy struck. Clara held one of the letters, reading softly. He wrote, "I think Grant's team wants Jacob out of the way. They're planning something with the saddle straps." Jacob's chest tightened as she read the words. The guilt he carried for so long began to twist into something else: anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. "All this time," he whispered, "I thought I was cursed, but it was just a man's greed." Clara put a gentle hand on his arm. "You weren't cursed, Jacob. You were betrayed." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of wind whistling through the broken boards. For years, Jacob had lived believing he was the reason Eli died. Now the truth was both painful and freeing. Later that evening, they packed the documents carefully and returned to the ranch. Jacob placed the box on his kitchen table and poured them both some coffee. Clara spread the letters out like puzzle pieces, her eyes scanning every line for clues. "Grant Corman moved away years ago," she said. "But maybe someone in town still remembers him." Jacob nodded slowly. "Sheriff Daniels might. He was there that night too." The next morning, they drove into town. The small community hadn't changed much. Same general store, same dusty streets, same quiet faces. People turned their heads when Jacob's old truck passed by. Some smiled politely. Others whispered. It had been a long time since he'd been seen here. At the sheriff's office, the air smelled of old paper and coffee. Sheriff Daniels, now gray-haired and slower in movement, looked up from his desk and blinked in surprise. "Well, I'll be. Jacob Miller. Thought I'd never see you back in town." Jacob gave a small nod. "It's been a while, Sheriff." Daniels leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Heard you sold off half your ranch. Folks said you were done with everything." "I was," Jacob said. "But I found something that brought me back. About the night Eli Turner died." The sheriff's expression turned serious. "That night still haunts this town." "What about it?" Jacob set the letter on the desk. Daniels adjusted his glasses and read quietly. His brow furrowed as he reached the part about Grant Corman. "I remember that name," the sheriff said after a pause. "He left town right after the accident. Claimed he got a big offer to ride in Oklahoma. Never came back." "Did anyone ever investigate the saddle?" Clara asked softly. Daniel sighed. "We did a quick look. It was too damaged after the fall to prove anything. Folks said it was bad luck, and you, Jacob, you never wanted to talk about it." "Case closed," Jacob nodded slowly. "I thought it was my fault. I didn't want to drag anyone else down." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You still carrying that guilt, huh?" Jacob didn't answer. He didn't have to. Daniels leaned forward. "You got those letters, and that's something. I can't open a case this old, but if you want the town to know the truth, I'll stand by you." Clara smiled faintly. "That's all he needs." As they left the office, the midday sun was bright but gentle. Jacob walked quietly beside Clara, lost in thought. The truth didn't erase the past, but it gave him something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to keep moving. That evening, back at the ranch, Clara typed up everything they had found on her laptop. She organized Eli's letters, photographs, and notes into a single file. "We can publish this story," she said. "Not to make noise, but to tell people what really happened. Eli deserves that." Jacob looked at her uncertain. "You think anyone will care after all this time?" Clara smiled softly. "Maybe not everyone, but those who knew him, they'll finally know the truth, and you'll finally be free." Jacob walked to the window. The sunset painted the sky in colors he hadn't noticed in years. He took off his old hat and held it by his side. "Freedom," he said quietly. "Never thought I'd feel that word again." Clara closed her laptop and stood beside him. "You already earned it, Jacob. Eli gave his life trying to protect yours. Now it's your turn to live for both of you." He looked at her, his eyes soft but full of something new. "Gratitude. You know," he said slowly, "I think Eli would have liked you." Clara smiled. "I hope so. He sounds like he was the kind of man who saw good in people." Jacob chuckled quietly. "Yeah, he sure did." The two stood in silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. For the first time in a long time, Jacob didn't feel the weight of his curse. Instead, he felt Eli's presence, not as a ghost, but as a friend watching proudly. Before heading inside, Jacob looked out over his ranch and whispered softly, "I went deeper, old friend. I found what you wanted me to find." The wind rustled through the fields as if answering him. Clara turned to look at him, her eyes warm. "You're not done yet, Jacob," she said. "Tomorrow we tell the world." He nodded slowly. Tomorrow. That night, Jacob didn't dream of the accident. He dreamed of the rodeo again. Not the night of tragedy, but a bright, sunny day long before it, when he and Eli raced horses through the open plains, laughing like nothing could ever hurt them. And for the first time in years, he woke up smiling. The next morning came with a clear blue sky, the kind that made everything seem fresh and possible. For the first time in years, Jacob Miller didn't wake up with the same heavy heart. The burden he carried had begun to lift. The letters, the truth, and Clara's help had changed something deep inside him. But he also knew this was not the end. There was one more thing left to do. He had to face the people he had avoided for a decade. He stood on his porch, looking out at the open land. The fields were quiet except for the soft sound of wind brushing through the grass. He remembered how this land once echoed with laughter, how Eli used to visit on weekends to help with chores and tell stories about their future. Now, for the first time, those memories didn't hurt as much. They felt warm, like a reminder that some bonds never truly die. Inside the house, Clara sat at the table with her laptop open, reading over the story she had written. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was honest. She had included Eli's letters, Tom Hayes's note, and Jacob's words. It told the truth simply, how a man's greed caused another's death and how a cowboy carried the guilt for years until the truth set him free. When Jacob walked in, she looked up and smiled. "It's ready," she said softly. "Once you're sure, I'll send it to the local paper. People deserve to know." Jacob sat across from her, staring at the screen. His name appeared in the title, followed by a simple line, "The Cowboy Who Broke the Curse." It made him smile a little. "I like that," he said quietly. "It sounds like something Eli would have said." Clara nodded. "He wanted you to find peace. This will give that to both of you." Jacob thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it," he said. Clara hit the send button. The article was gone, off to the local paper's editor. The story that had been buried for years was now out in the open. The next few days were quiet but tense. Jacob spent most of his time outside, fixing fences and working the land. It helped calm his thoughts. But inside, he couldn't help feeling nervous. He didn't know how the town would react. Some people had believed in him once, but others had called him cursed, a man who brought bad luck. Now they'd all know the truth. 3 days later, Clara came running out of the house holding a folded newspaper. "Jacob," she shouted, smiling wide. "It's in." Jacob wiped his hands and took the paper. His eyes moved over the front page, and there it was, his story printed for everyone to see. The rodeo that hid a secret, how one man found redemption. It told everything in clear, simple words. It mentioned Eli's bravery, the betrayal by Grant Corman, and the years Jacob had lived under the shadow of guilt. Clara watched his expression. He didn't say anything for a long while, just kept staring at the paper. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "He'd be proud, Clara. You did right by him." That evening, the phone in the kitchen rang. Jacob hadn't heard that sound in years. He picked it up slowly. "Jacob?" The voice on the other end was rough but kind. "It's Sheriff Daniels. Just wanted you to know the paper's got folks talking. Half the town's been coming by asking about you." Jacob's stomach tightened. "Good or bad?" he asked. The sheriff chuckled softly. "Mostly good, son. People are sorry they believed the worst. There's a meeting at the community hall tomorrow night. You should come. They want to hear it from you." Jacob hesitated, then nodded to himself. "All right, Sheriff. I'll be there." When he hung up, Clara looked at him with a small, encouraging smile. "You should go. It's time." The next evening, the small community hall was full. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of people who hadn't gathered there in years. Old rodeo posters still hung on the walls, their colors faded but full of memories. Jacob stood outside for a while before walking in. The air was thick with whispers as heads turned toward him. For a moment, the room went silent. Then Sheriff Daniels stepped forward. "Folks," he said, his deep voice carrying through the hall, "you all know Jacob Miller. For years, we believed he caused the accident that took Eli Turner's life. But that wasn't true. The truth's come out now, and it's time we listen to the man himself." Daniel stepped aside, and all eyes turned to Jacob. He hadn't spoken in front of a crowd since that terrible night. He took a breath, steadying himself. "I don't have fancy words," he began. "For years, I thought I was the reason my best friend died. I carried that guilt like a stone tied to my soul. But now I know the truth. It wasn't fate. It wasn't a curse. It was betrayal. Someone else's greed cost a good man his life." The crowd stayed silent, listening. Jacob's voice was calm but full of feeling. "Eli was like a brother to me," he continued. "He believed in doing what's right no matter the cost. He found out the truth that night and tried to save me, and in the end he did. I'm here today because of his courage. For a long time I ran from that. I shut people out. But a good friend, his daughter, helped me see that running from pain only makes it worse. You've got to face it to heal." He paused, looking around the room. He saw old faces. Men he used to ride with, women who had cheered in the stands, children who had grown up and now looked at him with respect instead of fear. "I didn't come here for pity," he said softly. "I came to tell you this. Eli deserves to be remembered as the hero he was. And as for me, I'm not cursed. I'm just a man who took a long time to forgive himself." There was silence for a few seconds. Then someone in the back started clapping. Another joined in, and soon the whole hall was filled with applause. Jacob felt his throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from pain, it was from relief. After the meeting, people came up to him one by one. Old friends shook his hand. A woman who once ran the rodeo office said softly, "I'm sorry for what we said back then, Jacob." He nodded kindly, forgiving without words. Clara stood near the door, watching with a warm smile. When the crowd thinned, she walked up to him. "You did it," she said. Jacob looked at her, his eyes glistening under the dim light. "No," he said gently. "We did it. Eli, your father, all of you helped me find my way back." They stepped outside together. The sky was dark, filled with stars. The town lights glowed softly in the distance. Clara turned to him. "What will you do now?" Jacob thought for a moment. "I think I'll go see him," he said. "One last time." The next morning, Jacob drove out to the old cemetery just beyond the hills. He carried a small wooden cross he had carved himself with Eli's name etched on it. The grave was simple, surrounded by wildflowers that grew freely in the Texas soil. He knelt down, placing the cross gently beside the headstone. "You were right," he said quietly. "The truth was buried deeper than I thought. But I found it, partner. I found it." The wind blew softly through the grass. Jacob closed his eyes and let the peace wash over him. He didn't feel haunted anymore. He felt light, free, and finally forgiven. When he stood up, Clara was waiting by the truck. "Was it hard?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, it was right." As they drove back toward the ranch, the morning sun shone bright across the horizon. Jacob looked out the window and smiled. The land didn't look empty anymore. It looked alive again. That evening, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sunset. Clara joined him, notebook in hand. "People love the story," she said. "The paper said it's one of the most read articles this month." Jacob smiled faintly. "It's not about fame," he said. "It's about truth." "And peace," Clara nodded. "Both found you at last." Jacob looked at her and said softly, "Maybe redemption isn't something you earn. Maybe it's something you're given when you stop running." She smiled. "I think Eli would agree." Jacob looked out toward the glowing fields, his heart calm at last. The cowboy who once carried a curse now carried hope. And for the first time in many years, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness but for gratitude. Weeks passed since the truth came out, and life on Jacob Miller's ranch began to feel different. The air seemed lighter, the days brighter. The ranch that once felt like a prison of silence was slowly turning into a place of peace again. The people who had once avoided him now waved when they passed by on the road. Some even stopped by to talk, bringing fresh bread, fence supplies, or simply a smile. It was strange at first, but Jacob welcomed it quietly. Clara stayed on the ranch longer than she planned. She said it was to help him organize the old letters and stories. But Jacob knew there was more to it. They had become friends, true friends like the kind he hadn't had since Eli. She had a gentle way of bringing life back into every quiet corner. When she talked, even the wind seemed to listen. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, Clara looked at the empty field near the barn and said, "You ever think of teaching again?" Jacob chuckled softly. "Teaching what? How to fall off a bull?" She smiled. "No, how to stay on one. There are young riders in town who dream about the rodeo just like you and Eli did. They could learn from you." Jacob looked out at the open land. The idea made him pause. He hadn't thought about training anyone since the accident. But the thought of passing on what he had learned, both the skill and the wisdom, felt right. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time." Within a month, the ranch came alive again. Fences were repaired, the old arena was cleaned, and new saddles hung neatly in the barn. Word spread quickly through town. Jacob Miller, the man who once rode like the wind, was starting a small training camp for young riders. Parents brought their kids, curious and excited. Some of them had grown up hearing stories about the cursed cowboy. Now, they saw something different. A man who smiled, who taught with patience, and who never raised his voice. The first day of training, 5 young riders showed up. Their horses kicked up dust and their faces shone with excitement. Jacob watched them from the gate for a moment before stepping forward. "All right," he said with a calm smile. "Let's see what you've got." The lessons were simple at first. He taught them how to saddle properly, how to read a horse's movement, and most importantly, how to respect the animal. "A horse isn't just a tool," he said one morning. "It's a partner. You trust it, it trusts you." Clara watched from the sidelines, taking notes for a book she was writing about Jacob's journey. She smiled as she saw how naturally he taught. The kids admired him. They called him Mr. Miller at first, but soon, Coach Jacob became their favorite name for him. One afternoon, a young boy named Billy struggled to control his horse. He fell off twice, landing in the dirt, frustrated and embarrassed. The others laughed, but Jacob walked over calmly, helped him up, and dusted off his shoulders. "Don't listen to them," he said kindly. "Every great rider falls. What matters is you get up." Billy looked at him with tears in his eyes. "Did you ever fall?" Jacob smiled faintly. "More times than I can count, son. But every time I did, I got back up. Because that's what makes you a cowboy." The boy nodded, climbed back on the horse, and this time rode smoother, steadier. Clara watched from the porch, quietly writing. He's teaching them more than writing. He's teaching them how to stand tall again. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch became a place of laughter once more. The sound of hooves, the calls of young riders, and the smell of hay filled the air. Every sunset felt like a gift, a reminder that second chances were real. One evening, after the kids had gone home, Jacob sat by the fence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with gold and soft pink. Clara walked over with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "You've built something special here," she said softly. Jacob nodded. "It's not just me. It's Eli too. I feel like he's here watching them, proud of every one of them." Clara smiled. "He'd be proud of you, Jacob." Jacob looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, but steady. "I think I finally understand what he meant by those words," he said. Clara tilted her head. "You mean go deeper? Make it quick inside?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I thought it meant digging for something buried. But now I see it wasn't about the ground. It was about the heart. He wanted me to look inside myself, to face what I'd buried all these years. The truth, the pain, the forgiveness." Clara's eyes softened. "And you did." Jacob smiled, the kind of smile that carried peace. "Yeah, I did." The days rolled on and the ranch continued to grow. More kids joined, and soon Jacob had a full schedule of students. The local paper even wrote another story, calling his camp the Redemption Ranch. It became a symbol in the town, proof that people could change, that healing was possible. One Saturday, the town hosted its first rodeo in years. They invited Jacob to be the guest of honor. He stood at the center of the arena, surrounded by cheering families and young riders wearing cowboy hats too big for their heads. The mayor handed him a microphone. Jacob hesitated, then spoke in his calm, steady voice. "A long time ago, I thought my story ended in this arena. But now I know it was just beginning. Life will knock you down. It'll test your spirit. But if you keep faith, if you keep kindness in your heart, you'll find your way home again." The crowd clapped, and some even wiped away tears. Clara watched proudly from the stands, her notebook resting on her lap. She had finished writing her book, but she knew Jacob's story wasn't over. It was still being lived. Every day on that ranch, after the event, one of the young riders, Billy, ran up and hugged Jacob tightly. "Coach," he said with a big smile, "I won my first ribbon." Jacob laughed and ruffled his hair. "That's because you didn't give up," Billy nodded proudly. "Just like you taught me." As the sun set behind the stands, Jacob stood for a moment, letting the cheers fade into the distance. He looked up at the sky, and for a brief second he imagined Eli standing there, leaning against the fence, smiling that same easy smile. "Guess we did it, partner," Jacob whispered. "We broke the curse." That night back at the ranch, Clara brought him a copy of her finished book. On the cover was a photo of the ranch at sunrise, and the title read, "The Cowboy Who Found Redemption." Inside, she had written a small note. For Jacob Miller, who went deeper, found the truth, and taught others how to rise again. Jacob closed the book gently and said, "You made it sound better than it really was." Clara smiled. "No," she said softly. "It's exactly what it was, real, honest, and brave." They sat together in the quiet evening, the sound of crickets filling the air. The stars shimmered above, and the world felt peaceful again. Jacob looked out across the fields that had seen his worst days and his best ones. "Eli always said life's like a ride," Jacob said. "Sometimes it throws you hard, but the trick is to hold on long enough to see the sunrise." Clara looked at him. "And you did." Jacob smiled. He whispered, looking toward the horizon. "I did." As the night deepened, the ranch lights glowed softly against the dark sky. The laughter of young riders echoed faintly from the training corral, and the wind carried the scent of hay and wildflowers through the air. Jacob leaned back in his chair, tipping his hat low over his eyes, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, peace, real peace, the kind that comes when a man has faced every ghost, told every truth, and found something worth living for again. The cowboy who once carried guilt now carried grace. The man who once feared the past now embraced the future. And as the stars sparkled above the quiet Texas plains, Jacob Miller finally understood. Redemption wasn't found in escaping pain. It was found in transforming it into something good. And that's exactly what he did.